We're going to host a session around multi-club ownership. Just want to throw it out to the room first. We're going to use some slides just to frame up the topic a little bit. Just throw out a number for me. How many multi-club ownership groups do you think exist today? It's not an exact science because it's not openly public source information, but roughly how many multi-club ownership groups exist in sport in general, not just in football? Go on, someone brave, shout a number out. 100, great. And higher or lower? 250, lower, higher. Everybody else? Keep the numbers going, I love it. Great. Okay, so roughly from a research perspective, you're going to see there's roughly around 116 groups that exist in sport today. The vast majority of those are also invested into football. That means investment into almost 400 teams around the world too. And if you look at how that is structured in the sense of where investment is coming from, around 50% of that is coming from the US. So in terms of investment money coming in, the majority of that money comes from the US and the investment into multi-club ownership groups. Around a quarter of that comes into Europe, and then the rest of the world makes up the rest of the numbers involved in that. And this is all information that I've been tracking for many years, particularly from my time back at City Football Group. I joined them in 2008, and in 2014 we went to multi-club ownership. And this is one of the tasks that I had, was to try and track the groups and try and learn from groups too, because back then we were starting it for the first time. When you look at that as a map around the world, it looks something like this. And you can see a high density in Europe, obviously where we're based today, and that looks something like this. So you have high pockets in England. Belgium is another huge investment area for multi-club ownership. So, handing over to our panel here, Nancy and Scott. Start with you, Nancy. Why do you think that the growth in multi-club ownership group is happening?
So I will answer it from a women's football perspective specifically, because we are a purpose-built MCO for women's football. I think for women's football, which has been literally starved of resources for a long, long time, multi-club ownership comes into play very nicely there, because it'll allow for helping infuse resources that didn't exist in the organization before, and help provide a little bit more structure, not just from the football operations, just core business operations, commercial, things like that, that will help the teams actually grow and progress from where they are today. And I think it makes it perfect for women's football because of that reason, is that it'll bring in resources that did not exist in the club previously.
Yeah, I love that. Scott?
That's a really big question, of course. I think football's got an issue. If we reflect for a moment, football burns money terribly, and has done for a long time. The increase in transfer fees over the last 10 years and the associated increase in player salaries means it's costing a hell of a lot more money to run a football club. European football remains, in particular from your map there, very, very popular to investors. So we've seen a big change in the owner demographic over time. So we've now got high net worth individuals, investment funds, and even sovereign wealth now supporting the game. Why are they in the game? Because the European model in particular still it's not a closed league. So as you say, there's a huge proportion of American investors, and maybe there's less jeopardy and excitement in that aspect and that model. Although it's a high revenue generator, maybe there's a lack of jeopardy. So there's still some excitement, and I'm sure that some of the people invested in multi-club ownership feel that European football can learn from that American model, and they can grow and synergize that into a bigger platform here, I would say.
So let's look a little further now. We're going to go into a bit more of the rationales, a great lead into that part of it. Often there's a break or a combination between commercial needs and football needs when setting up a multi-club ownership group. That's like running any football club, it's exactly the same, but it's just at a much larger scale. And if I reflect on my time from when we set that up at City Football Group, the initial genesis, the idea, came from a commercial reason. It was about how do we grow our brand, our revenues at a global scale in a faster point of time that it's taken established, successful clubs like your Real Madrid's, Manchester United's, Barcelona's at the time. How do you do that in a different, innovative way? So really the growth of City Football Group from a multi-club ownership came from a commercial reason first. Then it was, okay, the how do we start to change that? And that came into the football part. It was, okay, yes, if we play a particular style of football across the group, we feel that that's going to be interesting for different investors to come and sponsor and get involved in the group. And that was the basic genesis of the idea. Then we started to go into more things around kind of generating player value and often, obviously, team success. Sponsorship is important because it helps grow, and as Scott just alluded to, football has a history of burning cash quite quickly, and that helps to tighten up the pieces around the financial due diligence. And certainly for my time at City, that was a big part of it. In the early stages, it was very open and invest in everything. By the time I'd left, it became very much controlled for the right reasons. And also there's a big part there in real estate, being able to invest in actual real estate itself and grow value that way. So again, the question to come back to the group here is, how do you balance the commercial and football needs? Maybe Scott, I'll start with you first on that.
Of course. Obviously, these two are symbiotic. As I've said, in my responsibility in our department is to run the football section, and for that we need money to buy players, etc. So I think we've seen a huge change in the sponsorship landscape recently in some of our markets that our clubs are particularly in. Alcohol sponsorship, no longer viable. Cigarette sponsorship, no longer viable. And increasingly across Europe, gambling sponsorship, which is a little bit different to the UK presently, is also no longer viable. So finding sponsorship that reflects your identity and brand, as you put on the last slide, is really, really important. And equally, fan bases are becoming ever more cognizant of who the club partners with and who they would like to see on the front of their jersey. So it's a really, really important aspect of how the two work together. In one of our clubs, an example, we have the National State Lottery on the front of our jersey, but they're actually not on the jersey, which is quite an interesting dynamic because they paid not to be on the jersey. And we use the journey for social messaging and charity messaging, which is quite an interesting dynamic. I also think maybe commercially tech partnerships and collaborations with companies an interesting way of diversifying the commercial model where you can join the commercial and the football and you can share knowledge with, i.e. Statsbomb or a startup or innovation hub is also an interesting initiative for us.
So in women's football, the revenue is very different than men's football. So where the majority of men's football revenue comes from match day and broadcast contracts, the majority of women's football comes from sponsorship. So it is the sustainable revenue that is core to our success in women's football. That said, it kind of depends on the market. So if you look at the US market, for example, where we don't have relegation, commercial is king, right? And you can look no further than the most valuable team in the NWSL, which is Angel City, worth $250 million, is not the best team in the league. So commercial for them has been everything. Their success as a team has been primarily due to their commercial success. Before they ever stepped on the pitch, before the team ever walked out as a new team, they had over $30 million in commercial revenue. So in a league in Europe, though, where you have relegation, you've got to balance it a lot more. But that commercial revenue is so, so important. And in women's football, we haven't had the right structure to truly value our assets as much as possible. I think that's one thing that the NWSL has done really well, in particular Angel City, where the front of jersey wasn't just a free-for-all. It was truly a high-valued asset. And so when they launched their team, they weren't going to take anything less than what they felt that front of kit was worth. Traditionally, that hasn't been the case in women's football. So I think balancing out, obviously being able to pay the women a decent salary, because that's been an issue, but also really, really investing in the commercial side has to be, it's vital. It's our sustainable revenue.
Okay, let's look forward ahead into a bit of good practice. And as data specialists in the room, I think this is something that you could reflect on and take away from definitely from this session. There's some interesting good lessons to take in terms of good practice when it comes to setting up any successful club, irrespective of whether they're multi-club or not, but certainly from a the theme today, this is important to think about. The first is the organizational structure. It's that influence that you have over very key decision makers that are in the organization. The equivalent of the CEO, the president, the sporting director, and the head coach. If those three are aligned on the football side, you've got a really good chance of making things a success. If those three are not aligned, this is where you'll find problems. And for all the great work that you will be doing, this is where you'll find the conversion will drop dramatically. So it's really important if you are considering going to work for somewhere for the first time, or trying to understand what good practice looks like for your own future growth from a pathway perspective, I would encourage you to really look at this organizational approach before you venture into these new examples. It's something that I wish I'd been given advice of many, many years ago when I first started working in football. Actually, my first job working in football was at Bolton Wanderers, and I was, on reflection, so surprisingly lucky because at that organisation, that was aligned. And I thought, oh, all football's like that. It was only after I left I suddenly realised, well, football is not like that at all. So if you want to give yourself the best possible chance of being success, my advice to you is to really understand, first and foremost, what's the organisational structure look like and what is the relationship like between the key people? In this case, the equivalent of the CEO, president, sporting director, and head coach. If you're going down the football route, and obviously there's the equivalent on the commercial side. The next is to be clear on organisational objectives. How clear are they? And this again is where you can play a huge part in influencing that. Really understand and help simplify down the messages and get everyone on the same page. What is it you're trying to achieve? If, for example, you run a club and you're trying to develop on pitch value for your players, what percentage of minutes of under 21 players are you going to look for? And what does that look like in terms of history? Like, what does good look like? And where are we versus that benchmark? These are the things that would really resonate with people like Nancy and Scott on the stage. These are the things that they're looking for and interested in. The next one is, this is the third part of a four-part model, is what it takes to win. Really take time to understand what it takes to win in your context. So your context could be getting promoted. Well, what in history does it take to get promoted? Are you really clear on that? Is everyone around you clear on that? Are you working towards it? Are you holding yourself accountable to the journey that you're on? This is a big part of the role you have to influence those key decisions that are made. If you are looking to compete to win, that's got another set of what it takes to win in your context. And the last but not least is your game model. Now, you'll hear game model talked about a lot. You'll all be part of these different things. Game model does not just necessarily mean play possession football. Game model means the way that you want to approach the game itself. If I again go back to my time at Bolton Wanderers, we played a very direct style and then tried to play more creative in the final third. That was our game model, but we were super clear on what it was. Everyone knew about it. We researched it, we understood it, we played within our means. Going to City was different. It was about going to a more possession-based model. But really it's important to get this dynamic between four main parts. Your vision and philosophy, where you're going, are you super clear on that? Is everyone clear on it? Have you got the data and evidence to back it up in terms of that aligns to what good looks like? Then what is the game that you want to play? How do you detail that down into the phases of play? How do you break that down into the individual players, which is the next part? What players do you need to play that game model? And lastly, but not least, is what training methods do you need to apply to those players to play that game model to ultimately allow you to get to the vision philosophy? Now, a lot of you will be very experienced in football, and some of you will be starting your journeys. This part in particular, you'll find, is so different. Some are super clear on this, and some are not. And I think the multiple ownership groups that do very well do this in particular very well. They understand the game model in their context, and they bring it together. So, next question coming up to the panel here. Nancy, what roles should be embedded within a team within multiple ownership, please?
I mean, that's a great question. Again, I think it's very different for women's football versus men's football. When we acquired our team in Como, the first thing that we focused on was creating a new leadership team to set the vision and the culture that we wanted for the team. So our CEO was the first hire. COO followed shortly after that, new coach, our sporting director we had, and getting them all aligned. They had to set the stage. They had to set the culture. And then anything that they needed outside of that from the MCO was maybe a little bit of help on the analytics side, on the commercial side, setting up some more structured operations, setting up the commercial inventory, things like that. But for us, we want to push as much capability into the team as possible and make them self-sustaining and be able to function without us, essentially, and just provide them that extra help and resources and investment when they need it. But it really starts at setting the culture with the CEO, and that was our first hire. We hired a woman. She has actually more of a commercial background than a football background, because part of our vision is to really commercially supercharge these teams. The first thing we did when we acquired Como was to do a rebrand. And if you haven't seen it, you should check it out because it's pretty cool. That sets the stage for how we present the team to the sponsors, to the fans, and how we grow the fans globally. You talked about how do you grow an audience globally, and we always have this joke about you need Ryan Reynolds in a Netflix documentary. That's not possible for everyone, but that is the goal for almost every team. Is we all want to grow that audience globally, and in women's football, many of the fans don't actually attend the game, so having that connection digitally. We also hired a content creator. Having somebody who can create content and get it generated within the team is a really important thing for us because it feeds into that sponsorship revenue as well.
Scott and I are both father of daughters. We're fully invested in the women's football being successful. And Scott, obviously, women's football is part of your group as well, right? How do you approach that?
Yeah, we've been, that's one of our strategic objectives in the group, was to professionalize the women's game and have equality over that. So in our MLS club, we relaunched Utah Royals, which had been quite a successful team in the original iteration of the league. So we relaunched that as a expansion team for the second time, which is a really difficult task to start with a blank sheet of paper. And we had a firm desire that every member of staff would be female. So all the leadership team female, which is really amazing. Obviously, they've had a very, very tough season. I think the expansion teams have that generally in that particular league. But another part of our ambition was to give the 3 European women's teams the same status. And in Europe, those teams are normally under an amateur banner. So we had to change the statutes of the clubs a little bit and put the 3 teams inside the professional bubble, which allows them to have access to some of the services that Nancy mentions, allows them to be embedded and have equal footing, and then we can share knowledge and collaborate and work together. So we've been really happy. I set the clubs a challenge last year. A simple competition was to see which club could run with the idea of equality the furthest. So one club started with a joint training session, which was publicised, which was soft entry. They got a round of applause for that. And then the next club did a joint open day, and then the last club decided they'd win the competition, and they were the first club in the network to have their official team picture with both the men and women's teams on the same picture and all the staff, which was quite a moment for us because they'd taken the idea and run with it of their own accord, which is really pleasing for us. And we've just repeated that process with all the teams for a second year in a row. So we're slowly working incrementally to make sure that we deal with equity on both of those sides.
Scott, I'm going to stay with you on the game model part. Yeah. What's your approach that you'll take on game model from a multi-club ownership group perspective?
You and I have argued over this one for 18 months, just to let everyone know. If ever I have an hour at home and I don't have anything to do, I'll phone Ed and have an argument about game models, because I know he's so Manchester City focused from his days, he can't let it go. My 20 months experience in a multi-club network leads me to have a slightly different view, having been on the shop floor at these clubs. Football in every single country has grown along the lines of national identity, cultural norms, and the influences that the footballers of that country over a period of time have been able to take and glean from other missionaries, let's say, that have passed through, if you take South America, etc. And I think football has such a strong, as we see at World Cups and the Euros and the Copa America, football has such a strong nationalistic identity. And I think over time, my experience being a scout over a long time and now in this role, sees that the fans see themselves through that identity clearly. Otherwise, we wouldn't have crazy men in Spain with Union Jack shorts on every World Cup jumping up and down. So to put a prescriptive game model across all of your network, I don't think from my experience actually works, because the fan base and the club see themselves as unique and a representation of the journey their clubs had over a period of time. So my philosophy is that doesn't necessarily work. We've got a club in Belgium and a club in Holland that are probably 60 kilometres apart, and both the coaching staffs and the players and the fans think they're playing two completely different styles of football, even though they're only 60k apart. But to turn back to the point you made earlier, you can have a general thematic of how you play the game, which I think can be common across all of your teams. You're an attacking team, you're in a counter-attacking team, or as we said this week on one of our discussions, maybe game model doesn't exist and you're into relationism and your players can go where they want and it's all about human connection. So there's lots of different ways, but I think you have to respect the culture and the identity of the club, because you want your fans to see themselves through that.
I love it. And that's a great example of in multi-club ownership group and in football in general, where it's important to have different opinions, right? You're not always going to agree on absolutely everything, but that's why it's important to discuss that, right?
But also, as you said on your slide, what it takes to win in each of these markets is different. So putting the style of play from Estoril in Portugal into ADO Den Haag is really probably going to fail. So in each of the clubs, when we audited the clubs when I joined, we did a deep dive into what it takes to win in each of those markets over a 10-year trend, what characteristics do those teams have, what type of players do they have, and that should help you shrink the variables and also start to build your squad in a way that increases the chances of success in that particular market is the idea.
Love that. Great insight. Nancy, I'm going to come back to you. Do women's clubs require different types of shared services from a multi-club ownership perspective than maybe their male counterparts? What do you think?
Besides that, they need everything, because they've been drained of resources or starved of resources for so long. I think the answer is absolutely yes. The commercial is much more important, but it's not just the commercial local getting the sponsors, because for like our team in Como, there were 80 local sponsors. So they did really, really well within their community. But our goal is actually to expand that out globally, to build beyond just the Lake Como community. And so that is definitely needed, because we want them to stay very community focused and ingrained in the community. There needed to be some more help to bring in sponsors and partners that were beyond that. But also, analytics is, and I don't want to take too much away from my talk later today, but analytics is still much slower to adopt in women's football, and it's mainly because of the resources. And so I think that's really, really vital for an MCO to be able to provide analytics support and help, and to start to get people to embrace data, because it is really, really important to the growth across so many aspects of the game. So I think that's a key shared service that probably men's football is much more embedded into the teams, and I'm hoping that we get there very, very soon. But it's a cultural change for a lot of the women's teams, because we've been in survival mode for so long that analytics was a nice to have.
Yeah, right. That's really great insight. What's your approach of or your take on shared resources between your group?
I've got a slightly longer history of this. I remember in my last role at Chelsea, pre-lockdown, we went and visited the famous and very successful coach Emma Hayes. We were perhaps looking around for a new project, because we were maybe 7 years in at the time and we're looking for innovation. And we went and said to Emma, look, scouting is going to be the next big breakthrough in the women's game at that time in 2018, whenever we had the discussion, because we sensed that Chelsea's advantage in the women's game at that time was a financial advantage, similar to as it was maybe in 2004 when Roman took over. And incrementally over time, your gain, or your advantage, minimizes, because people catch up and learn from your practices. And I could sense that maybe Chelsea's was going to, in the women's team, similarly going to be dissolved a little bit, because Man United and the bigger clubs at that time, with the Me Too movement, were realizing that having a women's team was a strategic advantage. So our advantage was diminished. So we put a program together to start in its infancy, the scouting program for Chelsea's women. And seems obvious now, but we just simply embedded that within the men's scouting department and put their data and their reports onto the one database, and embedded their scouts into the workshops and the seminars and the conferences we did, and had complete equality on it. And I think it's been maintained to this day, that particular program, and we were quite proud of that at the time. But I think, scouting is probably the easiest one, because the others with sports and exercise science and welfare, etc. There are some nuances you have to be very, very cognizant of, clearly. But I think there are some more services that over time will become more common across both the work and embed and share.
Let's go a little deeper on the approach of data then, like within that shared services, like what would good look like in terms of the approach to data within a multi-club ownership group?
So I think that has to be centralized for me, because we want to be using the scouting intelligence into that. But also we want to be able to leverage that data across all of the clubs so they all benefit, so we're not working in silos. So that's our model, and our philosophy is to have a central hub.
Yeah. What's your take on that, Nancy?
I think because we're still starting in a lot more basic level, we're not quite there yet. So just providing the services to get the teams using the data, embracing the data, that's really where we're starting. And that's what the most important shared service we can do is to provide that capability and support. We're not quite where you guys are. As you just said, women's football has really just come into play more from an analytics perspective in the last few years, and we have a long way to go. But I hope in the future that's going to change quite significantly.
I'd say from my experience of getting to work with lots of multi-club ownership groups since joining Hudl, and certainly my experience previously at City, the groups tend to fall into a couple of different camps. One that are truly centralizing things, truly doing ID mapping of data sources, setting up automation so that people like yourselves can get on there and use and do amazing things with it. And others that are not doing that, they're doing it more project-based. They're doing it more just run a call of an API, get it for the particular project that they need, and then that intelligence doesn't necessarily stay central to the organization. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses to both approaches. My personal preference is the former. It's the ability to create an infrastructure that can be handed over and used as a custodian. And this is another point I would like to stress to you as data specialists. And it's important in football in general. We all play in a role around being a custodian. This idea that at some point you're going to hand over to somebody else. And I think you should really take care in what it is you're going to hand over to the next person that takes on your role. Because I think that's super important for the industry. And for people like Nancy and Scott here, this is the type of thing that they need to know is happening behind the scenes, that there is good infrastructure, that there is good work going on, that can then be handed over to the next person that takes on that next generation. And so you play a really important role in doing that.
Ed, if I might add something there as well, it also depends on the type of multi-club model you are. If it's hierarchical, then the data profile and the data exemplar paradigm will come from the top, and all the feeder clubs will work towards achieving that standard. Or you're a meritocracy, where all of your clubs are on one level and you treat them as unique individual clubs, which is our model. And that slightly changes how you're going to integrate and use data across that platform.
And that's actually a good point. I think the initiative around data has to be coming from the top and centralized. But to actually build those resources within the teams themselves, I think is going to be really important for our success in the future.
Love that. Scott, I'll come back to you for one more, please. What are the biggest challenges between that MCO group level and the club's relationship? Like, what are the biggest challenges that you kind of face?
So I had hair when I started. Paul Bonus is now questioning that because he's saying I never had hair. The biggest challenge is a human. The beauty of the game is it's a human-focused pursuit. Okay, so it's getting different people from different backgrounds and languages and cultures to actually work together in this intense, volatile environment that we work in. So the biggest challenges are to build synergistic relationships across your clubs. That's really, really difficult. So as you said on one of your earlier slides there, I think there's actually 4 people that are important in the club. So there's the CEO, who'll be generally seen as the revenue generator, the sports director to manage the ins and outs and the strategy around the team, the coach to coach it. But also if you're taking a medium and a long-term view as part of your strategy, I think the academy director is also really, really important for the player development pipeline and the benefits that brings also from revenue down the line if you produce a successful player. The biggest challenges are, as I say, is the synergistic relationships between those. So what we've done, we see our clubs as 5 independent clubs for the reasons explained about culture, identity, connection with fan base and sponsors and the community. That's really, really important. But there are shared services and possibilities to knowledge share, peer-to-peer discussions. So we've set up horizontal working groups for scouting, for medical, CEO working group as well, and a goalkeeper working group, so that we can get people in rooms together, share ideas, share best practice, invite speakers in. And that way we build a social connection with our group, and we break down a little bit behind the scenes. We break down the tribal barrier of we're from Portugal, you're from Germany. But I'm sure many people in the room will know, and this is a great example of it, is when you get into a room with like-minded individuals, you actually learn, and people park their ego a little bit at the door, and then you can really learn from each other. And I've found great pleasure working in those working groups to get some ideas and break them down. And one of the other biggest things is keeping your fans happy and being transparent to your fans, communicating openly with your fans, because I would be a fool to think that any decision I make in Club A is independent of what happens in the rest of the network. You have to be very consistent, considered, and evidence-based in the decisions you make at any level, be that data, signing players, etc., because all the other clubs in the group pretend they're not watching, but they watch all the others because that's your behavioural precedent. So you have to have a shared mental model of how you deal with some of the critical issues around hiring staff, decision-making in your club, because the others will expect a similar standard from you across the rest of the group. So it's a sensitive point.
Love that. Great detail. What about from your perspective on that, your biggest challenges that you're facing in the...
Yeah, I think for us, it's that every club's needs are going to be very, very different. And so how do you plan for that? So I mentioned that, Como has done very well commercially with local, but other clubs we've looked at may have no commercial revenue. And so as an MCO, how do you plan for providing the right shared services model when every club's needs are going to be dramatically different? Independent clubs, Como is an independent club. There are going to be clubs that we acquire that are part of a men's club. Their needs are going to be different. So I think that's the biggest challenge we face. And so we've only had one club, so we're kind of a mono club ownership right now, but that will change quickly. But anticipating that and learning from that is going to be very interesting, so that we can be as supportive as possible and really provide the resources to grow the women's game. But I think that's our biggest challenge.
And you're right in the middle of the process of assessing potential investments. Like, how do you approach that? What kind of criteria are you using to make that judgment?
It's a couple of things. One is we obviously look at the commercial viability of the club, because that's really important to sustaining it. We want to invest in a club, really up the commercial trajectory of it, because that's core to the revenue, and grow it, and then hopefully at some point spin it off. So it'll be success as a result of our investment in that. We'll also look at the football operations. Obviously, it would be challenging to invest in a club that's fighting off relegation, because the investment levels would look very different. The shared services would also look very different. So the football operations need to be pretty solid, location, all of those things are important when we look at a club. But I would say commercial is probably the most important and because that is core to our thesis as an MCO, that we want to use that as a sustainable source of revenue. So it has to be commercially viable.
Yeah, I love that. We'd find the same when doing this at City. We basically have a three-pronged team. You would send in a consultancy company like Deloitte to get in deep on the finances. We had an internal team that was going to do a deep dive on the commercial side of viability of the organisation. And then I was working on the football side doing the same thing, going in and understanding everything from infrastructure, like do they own their own facilities, do they own their own training ground, is that is that fit for purpose, all the way through to have they got the right people in the right place.
Yeah, we look at that as well, because that's been a huge challenge in the women's game. The facilities and resources available to us also, again, affects the investment levels that we would make. So all of those things go into play when we're looking at the different clubs. But when you look at like a team like Como, who's been able to make it to Serie A as a promotion with the limited resources they've had, you see big potential and growth.
Absolutely. You can create a lot of creativity in that as well, right? Having low resources isn't always necessarily a bad thing, because you can get very creative in that space too, right?
Absolutely. And women's football is very open to that, which has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Okay, going into our final section here, we'll wrap up on the future of MCOs and get Scott and Nancy's opinion on that. Obviously, it's continuing to grow, and you see the examples of Red Bull coming to Leeds and Ineos into Manchester United, for example. But there's also challenges within that, the ability for teams to compete in similar competitions and things like that. So it's very interesting to see what the future will look like. The CIS who obviously do great work and are part funded by FIFA. This is their take on research, looking at only football clubs. So the pieces of information I showed you earlier comes from a broader piece. This is now looking at football in particular. But they suggest if you kind of extrapolate that out, that there could be like a 46% increase by 2025 of the number of MCOs just in football alone. Could get close to 120 teams. And in terms of from a number of teams that are created within a multi-club ownership group, that could increase by 76%. So we could get close to, again, over 300 clubs just in football by 2025 that are part of a multi-club ownership group. And in the UEFA landscape report, not this time, but last year's report, and the QR code is there if you want to scan it and go and see it in detail, they did a whole section on the multi-club investments and what that is. And we know there's plenty of discussion going on about what the future would be. I always take a view on that particularly coming from it from a city perspective, it's really helped stabilise some clubs that otherwise probably would have gone bankrupt. There's a reality to the investment part here, and when MCOs are run well, often it's about stabilising the club financially and setting them up for future success. And I think that's when it works well. It certainly includes that. So, last couple of questions. First one would be, are MCOs or private investment important for the sustainability and growth of football? And if so, why do you think that is? Nancy, sure. Scott, you had the microphone.
Well, clearly, as we mentioned at the very start of the talk, I think they're really, really important. And I think there is quite a large part and motivation for the sustainability part from these investors. As you say, there's barely a week goes by, particularly in the English footballing landscape, that a club isn't under threat and about to go bust because it's living above its means, very, very sadly. So I think the people that bring the investment to the MCO bring far better financial rigor, business rigor, some business acumen that allows clubs to survive and have better operations behind the scenes to sustain it into the future. And that is quite interesting because it's a paradox in a way, because the fans still seem quite suspicious of what an MCO is. They're quite, but they need the money for their club to stay. So I'm sure there's quite a lot of football fans around the world are quite conflicted about what is an MCO and what is the real benefit of it, and is my club losing its soul to an anonymous bunch of investors a little bit. But I think presently it's certainly a very strong trend. Football is in a constant state of flux, and this seems to be the latest really big seismic change. And UEFA and all the leagues are trying to balance how this fits in so that we can maintain the integrity of the game, which the fans love. I'm not so sure closed leagues will ever work in Europe, although there'll be some people calling for that at some point in the future, and that's going to be maybe the next pinch point with the type of investor we have, is for them to increase the revenue at the rate they wish it to increase. They might need some other constraints to accelerate that. But
or salary caps.
Or salary caps, yeah, as you say. But I think right now they're serving a really important benefit to the game while we calculate and figure out how we can actually be more financially stable as an industry.
Great point. Nancy, what's your take on that?
So I see women's football as a growth stock, and what a growth stock needs is investment. And MCOs, I think, are democratizing that investment into women's football even more so. There, like you mentioned, there are a lot of U.S. investors. I think there is in a romantic view of owning a football club for a lot of American wealthy individuals. And so we will have the advantage, we will be able to take advantage of that. But core to it needs the feed and caring and nurturing and investment for women's football to actually grow to the next stage. And MCOs are an important part of that. I think that even in the teams that we don't invest in, I think we're having an effect on the industry because we're calling for change, we're calling for equity, we're calling for more focus, more investment, more data, more commercial focus. So to me, it's crucial for the growth of women's football in general.
Love that. I'll stay with you, Nancy, if I can, please. What excites you about the future for multi-club ownership groups and football in general?
I'm excited to see some of the changes actually happening just actually within the last few years. I mean, when I first started becoming a very vocal advocate of women's sports, we were in a much different place only just a few years ago. So we didn't have equal pay in the US, and we didn't have the focus, and we didn't have the conversation, we didn't have the exposure, we didn't have the commercial contracts, we didn't have the media contracts increasing. And so all of these things are these great growth indicators that show that it is making a difference. I mean, you look at the NWSL media contracts gone up 40x. The changes that are happening in the WSL are all really positive growth indicators. And so it's happened very quickly. And so I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the next few years. But when you just look at all the numbers, like if you were to strip away the fact that it's women's football and you were looking at it from a business investment perspective, it would be a no-brainer. You would be like, yeah, I'm going to invest in this. This is great. This has got a great return on investment. And I think the more exposure we get and the more conversations we have, and so I'm happy to be at Statsbomb talking about it, that's what really excites me, because then that growth stock's going to really take off like a rocket ship.
Love that. Great summary there, Nancy. Thank you. Scott, what about yourself?
If I can be really a little bit more narrow in my answer to this particular one, football and MCOs, I would like to see, I'm not so sure there's a de facto exemplar for what the best multi-club ownership is yet. I think people in the room would maybe suggest that Red Bull's that, perhaps. I think Red Bull have a certain advantage I think there's an advantage to the geographical proximity of their hub clubs, the Liefering and the Salzburg and Leipzig. That makes it a little bit easier culturally and communication-wise, and it can become a hothouse. If your network's spread wider, it's a little bit harder to do that. So my ambition is to make our network work optimally and efficiently, and to be human first, and to make sure that our clubs achieve their performance objectives. And my ambition is to have players that come into our network and we provide a service, ambition and opportunities for them that they can spend all their career in our particular network if possible, and have a community and build that community of multi-club ownership. That's my ambition.
Great point to end on. Thank you very much for your time. Please give a round of applause for Nancy and for Scott.
Thank you.